It's been a while since we've checked in on the S10 Blazer, so in this episode we'll talk about a lot of the small repairs and upgrades that have been done to the vehicle, as well as some of the adventures that we've taken it on. The first thing we'll do is take a look at the front brakes and replace a few parts we have neglected. When I bought this thing, the rotors were rusted solid, so I actually put the wire wheel on the grinder and ground off all the rust. And the pads seemed fine, so I used them too. It was supposed to be a temporary solution, but when I started driving it, it braked really well, so I kind of forgot about it, honestly. But there are a couple problems here. First off, you can already see the surface finish on that rotor. It's not exactly smooth. See all those grooves, all the pitting, everything going on there? All of that is making a lot of friction. Since the pads are touching the rotor at all times, friction between those two parts is making a lot of heat and wasting a lot of energy. You can also feel and hear an unevenness in the rotor, which appears as a pulsing in the brakes as they are applied. This could be that the rotor isn't sitting flat against the hub, but it's much more likely that it's from the uneven surface finish or disc thickness variation. I found a good deal on very cheap brake parts, so I managed to get new brake pads and rotors for the front for around $60 total. Of course, these aren't high-end race parts, but for the Blazer, they should be just fine. And since I've taken the rotors off before, this should be a very easy job. These took a lot of doing to get off the first time, a lot of hammering and some other things which may well have been what ruined the hub bearings in the first place. So I'm glad that that part is not going to be a problem. So we'll pop off the brake caliper and the rotor will come right off. To remove the calipers, all we have to do is remove the slide pins and then pull it right off. And once it's off, we can separate the brake pads from the caliper. And we'll hang up the brake caliper on a bungee cord to make sure we're not unnecessarily pulling on the brake hose. And the rotor can come right off. So there's certainly less drag now, but it's still pretty heavy to turn it. It must just be that differential. And it is disconnected, it's not turning on the other side, so maybe this won't have my gas mileage out that much after all. Still, these rotors are absolutely trashed. So it's definitely a good idea to replace them. Try to clean up this hub surface a bit. And I really should have done this when I put the hub on. I must have forgotten. Just a thin layer of anti-seize. Help keep them from sticking and hopefully help keep rust from forming and causing a run out. So here's one of our new rotors. It's got that nice rough crosshatch. And then we'll wipe it off thoroughly with brake cleaner to get all that protective oil off of it. Now the surface should be nice and clean, so we'll try not to touch it from now on. Just for a little bit of security, I like to put a lug nut on there. Now we can just try to wipe clean the brake caliper here, especially the slide pin bores and the slide pins themselves. And then we can open up our new brake pads. Make sure they're the same style, and they do appear to be. The old ones actually aren't very worn, so the new ones are just a little bit thicker. So I'll just compress the piston and the caliper a little bit. So like anything, there are tons of different ways to do this and tons of different opinions on compressing pistons. I'm going to show you how I have done it. I just put a piece of wood on the piston, just push it where you need it to be. If you need to push it in more than just a little, it's a great idea to take the cap off the brake fluid reservoir to let that pressure out, and we'll fit the clip on the new one. We'll give these a quick spray with brake clean, and then I'll put just a very small amount of grease on the surface of the piston and where the pads ride on the caliper. You want to be very careful not to get any grease on the surface of the pad or the rotor though. Then we'll get the pads back in place inside the caliper and slide the whole thing back into place. To help keep the rotor in place as we install the caliper, we'll just snug down 2 lug nuts on top of it. We'll put a little bit of anti-seize on the threads of the slide pin and a little bit of grease where the caliper rides on it. Then we'll install the slide pins and get them finger tight. And then we'll tighten the slide pins back up to 35 foot-pounds. Okay, so that's this side done. So it does feel better right now, but the caliper piston is still retracted a bit. And with the passenger side done, we'll repeat the same thing on the driver's side. Caliper removed, brake pads removed, rotor removed, everything cleaned up, little bit of anti-seize, new rotor cleaned and installed, new brake pads cleaned and installed on the caliper, caliper installed, slide pins torqued to spec. Then we'll give everything one last cleaning and reinstall the wheels. And then we'll torque the lug nuts to 95 foot-pounds. And with everything back together, we'll make sure the brakes work and take the truck for a test drive to bed in the new brake pads. There are differing opinions on the best way to bed in new brake pads, but generally the idea is you want to get them hot, but not let them sit in one place on the rotor. Repeated hard braking without stopping the vehicle completely is the best way to do this. Repeat until you're confident the brakes are warm, or you can start smelling the brake pads. Just make sure not to come to a complete stop when the brake pads are this hot, because they can end up sticking to the rotor. So that about takes care of the front brakes. Now they work great and there is no pulsing when coming to a stop. So next we'll take a look at the rear brakes, because the parking brake doesn't really do very much. It's currently applied fairly hard, but there's almost no resistance in the turning wheel. We messed with the drum brake star wheel adjusters a little bit, but it seemed like they were adjusting correctly and the regular brakes were working properly. Then we noticed that even while it's applied, the parking brake cable is still very loose. We basically just tightened up that nut using a guess and check method until the wheels were hard to turn at around 3 clicks on the parking brake. But even after tightening it, the parking brake was still displaying some weird behavior and we had to dig a little farther. After taking a closer look, we noticed this splice part of the cable can get caught up on the torsion bar cross member and hang up the left side of the parking brake. Not really sure why this was designed in a way that it was possible for this to happen, but it is certainly what was happening here. Our super simple fix was just to take a piece of rubber hose, put it over that splice, and zip tie it in place. That way, even if the cable is loose, it's not possible for it to get caught on the torsion bar cross member. So after that little fix and tightening up the parking brake cable just right, everything now works as it should. Without the parking brake applied, the wheel spins easily and freely. But after just a few clicks on the parking brake, it becomes very tough to turn. And once the parking brake is released, the wheel once again spins freely. Next on our list of repairs is a persistent coolant leak.
One problem I'm having with this truck is that it seems to keep losing coolant. Just looking at it, there's definitely some kind of coolant leak happening over here because it's running all the way up the radiator, all the way about to the coolant hose. I just tightened this again. I've tightened this a couple times. I hope it's just something funny with this hose and not a crack or something somewhere in the plastic over here. So for now, I'm just gonna keep filling it with coolant and see if that leak gets worse.
And the leak didn't get worse, but it also didn't stop. A few weeks later, really tired of refilling the coolant system at this point, we took another look at the problem. Well, 2 problems actually, since there was also a little bit of coolant leaking from the thermostat housing. I was pretty confident this gasket wasn't going to leak with RTV on both sides, so I'm kinda eating my words here. I'm pretty sure this thermostat housing is either a little bit warped or the intake manifold surface is just really not conducive to sealing. So we'll try to tackle both these coolant leaks at the same time.
The first thing we need to do is drain some of the coolant out of the radiator.
To do so, we'll loosen the radiator's drain valve, and we can use a hose hooked up to that to try to keep most of the coolant going where we want it to. Once a fair amount of coolant has come out, we'll retighten the drain valve. Then we'll loosen up the worm gear hose clamp and remove the upper radiator hose.
So there's the water neck that was bugging me all winter. What seems strange to me is that the ridge that would hold the hose on and normally help it seal does not go all the way around it. This ridge is only present on half of the neck. Maybe that makes it easier to remove the hose, but it sure doesn't help it seal. But there must be some reason to do that. So the hose only seals on this part of the filler. But if you'll notice, there's a significant seam here, like a mold seam in the plastic right at the top of the ridge traveling back to the radiator tank. I wonder if that hasn't contributed to the leak. I'm going to use a razor blade to take the point off of this seam to smooth it out a bit, and then we'll try another trick and hopefully get this hose to seal for good. Now the surface of the filler neck is pretty smooth. Hopefully that will provide a better seal.
This next trick is one I haven't tried before, but I've heard of here and there. We're going to take a piece of 1.5-inch heat shrink tubing and wrap it around this radiator hose fitting. The idea is to get a slightly tighter fit between the radiator and the hose, and then hopefully everything will seal a bit better. So with the piece of heat shrink slipped into place, we'll go ahead and heat it up slowly over the entire outer diameter to try to get a nice even fit around the radiator inlet. A bigger heat gun would definitely make this faster and easier, but a little butane torch like this is nice and small and easier to get into place in the engine bay. So with the heat shrink on there nice and even, we'll go ahead and give that some time to cool and remove the other end of the hose from the thermostat housing. Then we'll remove the 2 bolts holding the thermostat housing to the intake. If you think back, we had to repair the threads on one side, so one of these bolts is a 3/8 inch and the other is a 7/16. What might have been part of the problem is that I was tightening the 7/16 more than the 3/8. Even though the bigger threads can more readily take that, probably shouldn't have been doing that on opposite sides of the same housing. It's possible that this difference in torque was causing the housing to warp a little bit. So this time when we torque it down, we'll do so evenly on both sides. And with the housing, gasket, and thermostat removed, we'll give everything a nice cleaning. And while we're in there, we'll also replace the 195-degree thermostat with the 180-degree. Over the winter, we removed the 180-degree thermostat in favor of the 195 to get a little bit more cabin heat. But over the summer, on some 90 and 100-degree days, it does seem like the engine wants to overheat. Using the 180-degree thermostat won't necessarily make it less likely, but at least it'll buy us a little bit more time and give us a little more of a buffer for when it does start to overheat. Since we still haven't taken the carburetor back apart, the idle is stuck around 700 or 800 RPM, and that is contributing certainly to our issues. But for now, we'll start off by using a 180 thermostat and see where that gets us. We're also going to double gasket the thermostat housing to increase the chances of sealing. Each of these gaskets has a light coating of RTV on both sides. Then we'll reinstall the thermostat housing and the bolts with a little bit of anti-seize. We'll tighten each of the bolts a little bit and then come back 10 minutes later and torque both to 25 foot-pounds. Then we'll use a little bit of WD-40 to help get the radiator hose in place on the housing and the radiator. We'll slide the worm gear clamps into place and tighten everything down. Once both of the clamps were snug, we let everything sit for around an hour. Then we retightened the clamps and refilled the coolant system since the RTV should be set. We ran the engine for a while and got all the air out of the system and noticed no coolant leaks. It's been 6 months since we did this and the truck has not had any issues losing coolant since then. Along with those coolant leaks, another reoccurring battle we've had with this truck that hasn't really been shown in videos before has been with the rear view mirror. The other morning, I got into the truck, ready to leave, I slammed the door, and the mirror fell back off. I don't actually remember if I covered this in a video or not, but I had previously glued this on once before. When I got the truck, the mirror wasn't attached. So I tried 3 times, I think, 2 times with different rear view mirror adhesives from the parts store, and the 3rd time just with some generic super glue. That 3rd time it held up for almost 2 years, so I'm just gonna go ahead and use it again, I guess. I'm pretty confident the cold of the winter had something to do with that coming loose, because it was about 25 degrees out when I slammed that door. So what I did that 3rd time that really made it stick was I actually took some sandpaper and roughed up the glass a little bit. I figured that texture would help it grip better, and it seemed like it did. So it's a little cringy, but I'm gonna go ahead and do that again. You can't really see the scratches when the mirror is attached because it covers them up and the glue kind of fills them in, so it's not really even noticeable. But I'm gonna rough up the glass a little bit, rough up the metal plate on the mirror, and super glue it right back on there. We'll clean up all the old adhesive, first by scraping it off and then using Goof Off to get a nice clean surface. Then we'll put a few drops of super glue on the anchor plate and hold it up against the glass. We'll keep solid pressure on it for around 2 minutes. So we'll let that cure for a day or 2 before I hang the mirror back on it, but that should be good. And it did hold the mirror up for about a week. Then after driving through some of the bumpiest parts of DC, the next morning the mirror was once again hanging. At this point I pretty much declared war on the thing, and I mixed up some good old-fashioned JB Weld. The surface prep was the same as what we did for the super glue, except this time using a little bit of our favorite epoxy. We held it up against the windshield with that same firm pressure and then used a piece of duct tape to hold it solid to the windshield for the next 2 days. Since then, we've been lucky and have not had any more issues with the mirror. So at least for now, it seems like JB Weld is the way to go for sticking things to glass. However, that rearview mirror falling off is not the worst thing that DC roads have done to this truck. We were driving through town in the typical city stop-and-go traffic when I noticed the temperature gauge had started to climb, and it wasn't stopping. I made sure the radiator fan switch was on. It was, but between the truck and the sounds of the city, I couldn't tell whether the fans were actually running. It was 5 or 10 minutes before we could get off the busy main road onto a side road that had parking. By the time we got there, the temperature gauge on the dash had almost touched 260 degrees. We immediately shut it off and went to check it out and noticed the radiator fans were in fact not running. The first thing to check is the radiator fan fuse, which immediately looks a little funny. The fuse isn't actually blown, but the plastic around the metal terminals has melted. It seems like the fit of the fuse in the fuse holder wasn't very good, and all the vibration of going over the city potholes seems to have caused enough heat in the fuse to start melting it. For a quick fix, we popped open the interior fuse panel and removed the 20 amp fuse for the horn, since the button for it doesn't work anyway. And with that fuse popped into the holder, the radiator fans once again work. After that, we started the engine again and let it idle with the fans running until everything cooled down, and we were able to make it out of the city no problem. The next day, I removed the plastic body of the fuse holder from the terminals and crimped them down a little bit tighter to make sure everything fits super tightly. So now the fuse holder seems pretty solid, and we're just gonna leave the 20 amp fuse in there. 15 was cutting it a little bit close anyway. And since this fix, we've had no more issues turning on the radiator fans. A little bit later on though, I noticed a loud ticking coming from the right side of the engine. It didn't take long to diagnose this as an exhaust manifold gasket leak. It's possible this was due to that overheating because the whole gasket shifted over and the bolts were a little bit loose. But whatever the cause, we're gonna go ahead and replace this gasket. First, we'll loosen all of the exhaust manifold bolts. We'll start at the edges and work our way towards the center. And once they're loose, we'll remove all the bolts. We're leaving the manifold bolted to the Y pipe so it shouldn't go anywhere. Then we can grab the exhaust manifold gasket and wiggle it away from the engine. The gasket was pretty frickin' torn, so there's no surprise that it had been leaking. This was one of the one-piece exhaust manifold gaskets that came in the engine rebuild kit. We'll replace it with gaskets that are a similar material, although they are individual pieces. As long as we make sure the bolts stay tight, these are cheap and should do the job. Before reinstalling anything, we'll pull the manifold away from the head just a little bit and use some Scotch-Brite to clean up the surface of the exhaust ports. We'll make sure to clean up the exhaust manifold bolts, especially the one where it had been leaking. Then we'll loosely reinstall each of the exhaust manifold bolts and slot in each of the exhaust manifold gaskets. The gaskets with slotted bolt holes are nice since you can just drop them in like this. Then we'll go through and tighten up each of the bolts and torque them to 30 foot-pounds. And then we're done. We started it up and no more exhaust manifold leak. But there was still something else that had bothered me every time the engine was running since installing it. The accessory drive system from the factory had a whole bunch of braces for stuff like the alternator. However, with this intake manifold, there simply weren't provisions for those braces, so we had been running it without any of them. Everything seemed pretty sturdy except for the alternator. There was a visual bounce and vibration to it when the engine was running. If nothing else, it's definitely not good for the bearings in the alternator. So we decided to make our own brace for this alternator in this intake manifold. To make it, we used 3/4 inch wide, 1/8 inch thick strap steel. And with a little bit of eyeballing, a little bit of measuring, some cutting, some drilling, and bending, we had something to start with. From there, we welded 3 separate pieces together to make it more 3-dimensional and rigid, and basically just did a lot of guessing and checking and test fitting until everything seemed just right. And then we fully welded it and cleaned it up with some paint. It's a little tricky to get installed with everything else that's in the way, but pretty soon it was all together. And once those 2 bolts are tight, the brace is fully installed. And with that additional brace attaching the alternator to the intake manifold, everything seems much sturdier. There is much less visible vibration in the accessory drive. It also eliminated a squeak that sometimes occurred on cold startups. And that's pretty much the last thing we did to the Blazer. But let's talk about some of the things we've done with the Blazer. It's not the most comfortable, it's not the safest, and it's certainly not the quietest vehicle, but it does a good job of getting from point A to point B. It's also been great for transporting cargo. Of course, it's not nearly as big as a full-size pickup, but as long as you're good at Tetris, it is a very useful utility vehicle. Over the summer, we picked up some of these big shelves from the hardware store to help organize the garage. They were a very tight fit, but we managed to get everything into the back of the Blazer. We also drove it up to a campground in northwestern Maryland. There were lots of hills and some somewhat rough terrain getting there, but it did it no problem. It also makes a handy and pretty comfortable bed. During the time that I've had it, the Blazer really has served me well. It did get pretty warm coming over the hills going to and coming back from camping, so there is some work that needs to be done. It could use a 2-core radiator and probably a better fan setup. I'd also like to get the wideband AFR gauge in this thing to get it tuned a bit better. The steering is also still pretty wandery, and I'd really like to upgrade the intermediate steering shaft. Because of that, for the time being, the Blazer is pretty much only being used to run errands. But just because we're not road tripping it doesn't mean we don't get to have some fun with it. Although, with no inner fender liners, it definitely doesn't like splashing through water like that. It's gonna need some kind of snorkel or at least a cover for the open element air filter if we're gonna keep doing that. It's not really ideal when you have to bail water out of the distributor and hold the carburetor open to try to dry everything out after you go through some water, although at least the spark plugs were dry, so it couldn't have been all that much that got in. At this point, it should be clear that this car and I have been through a lot together. It certainly hasn't always been perfect, and it continues to not be, but it's still running and still driving, and we fully intend to keep it that way. We've had the Blazer for around 2.5 years now, but it's really come a long way, and there's still a lot of work left to be done and modifications to make. So for the future, we'll just have to keep working on this truck and see where it takes us.
Yep.